It's the week ending Saturday the 8th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen local and mayoral elections across the UK, escalating tensions between France and Britain over post-Brexit fishing rights in Jersey, and Bill and Melinda Gates announcing their separation after 27 years of marriage. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kari Wilkin and the boss man, Holden Frith, plus freelancer Arion McNicoll. And Arion, I understand you have an exciting new daily podcast project to tell us about.
I do. It's called The Retrospectors, and it's a daily show where we take a deep dive into sort of strange side notes from this day in history. So, for example, so far we've looked at the prehistory of the board game Twister and the last ever US witch trial, and importantly, the guy who invented Hawaiian pizzas. And it stars Rebecca Messina, formerly of This Parish, and another person Unwrapped listeners may be familiar with, one Olly Mann, but he's kind of the most rubbish thing about the show.
Good use of the word stars, though. And you can find that by searching for The Retrospectors right now, using whatever app you're using to listen to this. Just type The Retrospectors and click subscribe or follow or whatever. Thanks, Arion. Glad you mentioned it. Right, back to business. And Kari, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are we ready for a trippy new era of mental health treatments?
I guess the biggest misconception people have about psychedelics is that these are drugs that make you crazy. And we now have evidence that that does happen sometimes. But in many more cases, these are drugs that can make you sane or more sane.
Author Michael Pollan talking to Time.com about the misconceptions around psychedelic drugs back in 2018. Kari, what are those misconceptions and what's happened this week?
Psychedelic drugs have had a bad rap really since sort of the 1960s, 1970s, in part because of, for example, people like Harvard psychologist Timothy Leary, who famously advised America's youth to turn on, tune in and drop out, and in doing so triggered a major moral panic. President Nixon described him as the most dangerous man in the US. And this had really bad repercussions for a lot of research that was going on at the time into how these hallucinogenics could be used to treat mental health disorders. I mean, to be fair, it wasn't just Leary's fault. Some of the studies were extreme, to put it mildly. There was one famous experiment in 1968 by a Canadian psychiatrist called Elliot Barker, who basically shoved a load of very violent psychopaths into a room for 11 days altogether, stripped them nude, and then gave them large amounts of LSD. And the theory was...
What could go wrong?
Exactly. Well, the theory was it was going to free them from social constraints and unlock the windows into their soul and mind. The result, fairly predictably, was just that they got really violent and even more disturbed. So,
okay, fascinating, but we're not doing the Week Unwrapped 1968. What's in the news now?
What drew my attention to this was a Bloomberg article about what they described dozens of startups that are competing to develop treatments based on hallucinatory substances for a whole really wide range of conditions, ranging from depression and addiction to PTSD. And at the same time, we're seeing so many reports almost on a weekly basis now about how drugs such as, for example, psilocybin, which is found in magic mushrooms, can be used to treat, for example, depression. So it's really going mainstream now. And, and experts are saying that basically these drugs have the potential to revolutionize the treatment of mental health conditions after decades really without much movement.
So, Holden, do you think there really has been 60 years of stigma around psychedelic drugs? Because obviously scientists have always carried on looking into it, but it seems like only now are people willing to come out and say, this is a really serious area of research we should look into for mental health.
Yeah, it does seem that the recreational reputation has put off a lot of scientists. There actually have been legal carve-outs for research into medical benefits of a lot of these subjects, even where they are illegal for recreational use. But there just hasn't been that much interest, and I think there's been some sort of professional fear of stigma that's held people back too. But the history actually goes back a lot further. There was in the 20s and 30s a lot of interest from people like Aldous Huxley and beyond it, and really and in fact Carl Jung too. The sort of birth of the psychoanalytic movement was there was at least an interest in how hallucinogenic drugs could help people access parts of their subconscious that they might not be in touch with in a conscious way.
Yeah, I do wonder though, Arion, whether now we know a little bit more about psychotherapy than we did then, whether we really need drugs to open up our subconscious, or as so often when you're talking about mental health, of course there's a portion of people that would benefit from pharmaceuticals, but there's probably a lot of people that just need someone to sit and talk to them, and they'll think, LSD, that's the solution. It might not be.
Yeah, I mean, and it's telling that even in this experiment that involved magic mushrooms, they coupled it with more conventional psychoanalytic and psychological sessions where they were trying to talk to people about their condition as well as administering them drugs. And I think that remains the prevailing sense of how best, in most cases, depression at least, should be treated. That you use drugs alongside all of these other kind of talking and musical therapies, and together they may help to get people out of the hole that they're in.
But it's not as if the drugs we've got currently, Kari, are so wonderful, is it? I mean, SSRIs are the most commonly prescribed thing for depression, and they have some serious side effects.
Exactly. It's a huge industry. And I think that's what these startups are trying to do, to break Big Pharma's stranglehold on the market. A market that was worth more than 26 billion in 2020. But as you say, these typical antidepressants, such as Prozac, they have major drawbacks. They're basically thought to work on the brain's stress system, so it mutes responses, but there's lots of side effects. They can be addictive. And, it may stop you feeling depressed, but it's not necessarily going to make you feel good. With psychedelics, the research suggests they basically diminish activity in an important part of the brain network called the default mode network, which is involved with operations to do with our sense of self. And users have reported sort of a sensation of ego dissolution. It kind of seems to lead to new connections in the brain temporarily forming. So you get new insights and perspectives and ways of looking at the world. I mean, the phrase I keep reading is that it reboots the brain. So yes, you might get that through talking therapy, but this is sort of pushing you in new directions that talking therapy might not lead to.
I mean, reboots the brain is quite a scary phrase, isn't it, Holden? I mean, I can understand that if you're really suffering and you're vulnerable and you're depressed, you might welcome that idea. But to me, turning off portions of my head, perhaps never to return, doesn't seem that appealing.
It does sound as if it could go either way, doesn't it? And researchers are definitely keen to discourage people from self-medicating because they say the way they've administered drugs in a lot of these trials has been in this sort of very safe setting with psychological guides and people making sure that people aren't having a bad trip, but also actually sort of encouraging them to an experience that is not just recreational but clinical as well. There do seem to be the effects of this can be quite long term. So people talk about measurable effects on your personality, which again is something that can be very positive, but also sounds as if it could potentially be alarming, in that you're having a one-off experience that could have an effect on your interaction with the world and other people for a very long time. Now, mostly that does seem to be positive. It seems to be that people become more open, they have more of a sense of ease with the world and with themselves in it. But yeah, it's something that I don't think, even the researchers who are most enthusiastic about this aren't suggesting that it's something that should be just done without deep thought.
I have to say I'm very enthusiastic about this, and it's worth pointing out that you don't actually have to trip. Like, as we talked about this recent study about magic mushrooms for treating depression, this is an Imperial College London study, and it found that as well as reducing symptoms of depression, people reported enhanced feelings of well-being. And, even up to a year later, they were reporting feeling, just happier. And those reports were backed up by the people who knew them, which is a big difference from traditional antidepressants. But there's also been a recent University of Maryland study which showed that blocking the hallucinogenic effects of magic mushrooms in mice didn't reduce the antidepressant effect. So, this doesn't have to involve some sort of, loopy, scoopy ride.
It also just feels appealing as an idea that maybe you could take a drug, have an individual experience, and then get better. One of the big criticisms of both SSRIs and SNRIs, the sort of predominant traditional antidepressant drugs that are used by most people currently, is that they breed dependence, and also that they're hard to get off at the end, that they involve like major withdrawal symptoms once you start to ease out of taking the drug. So you can understand why people would like the idea of a therapy that you could, have this sort of trippy experience, get in touch with something, and then potentially move on from there, which isn't necessarily the finding that they've got yet, but it just does seem like a good idea if you could get there.
But Kari, that self-medication point that Holden brought up is relevant, isn't it? Because yes, if you follow the medical use of it under supervision, that's an interesting thing to look at and should be looked at. But the problem is, if it gets talked about by newspapers and then people like us, people who are currently suffering with these issues might think, well, I'll try some psychedelics myself. And there's a difference there, isn't there, between cannabis being used increasingly as a treatment and this. Not to minimise the effects of cannabis on someone with mental health issues, but nonetheless, the effects of LSD are far more profound.
Yeah, I think actually, I think the more widespread use of marijuana and that to treat things, I think that is paving the way for these sort of drugs to go more mainstream. But as you say, it can give, yes, it can lead to very dangerous outcomes if you're already experiencing mental problems. And the proponents of this do say, you need to do your research. You need to have a properly trained therapist with you. Apparently, there is a booming market in properly trained therapists who are doing this, even though it's currently illegal, but again, that makes it harder to do your research and check that these people are safe. So yeah, it's definitely, to me, that seems like an argument to, for making it legal, so at least it can be regulated if it's already out there.
So, Holden, do you think we're going to see magic mushroom-derived products in Holland and Barrett, like CBD?
Probably not in Holland and Barrett, but I think probably somewhere in the health system. I think it looks fairly certain that they will find a niche. I do think, though, there is a bit of a tension between what Kari has been talking about the need for quality control on both the products that are being delivered. At the moment, if you went onto the dark web and ordered yourself some magic mushrooms, you would have no control, no knowledge over the quality of what you're receiving, the sort of dose levels, all of that information. But the tension against that kind of medicalization of the product and the process with what Arion was talking about, the more almost the more mystical side of mental health, the fact that it is about talking things through as well as the drug, and that really reaches back towards the sort of non-Western ideas of mental health. And I think a lot of people are familiar with ayahuasca in South America, and perhaps the way that other cultures have dealt with mental health problems that we have tended to medicalize with drugs. And I wonder actually whether if in making it a safer, more regulated process, you might also reduce some of the non-medical sides of the benefits that people can get out of these experiences.
And increase maybe some of the non-medical aesthetics, Arion. Something quite interesting I've been reading in the research about this is that people are taken into places that don't feel like hospitals when they're being monitored to take mind-altering substances. It feels like you're in a study or a den, the American reporter said in the report that I read. That's quite intriguing, isn't it? Because it's amazing how many mental health services are provided in places that feel cold and clinical and frightening to people.
Absolutely. And those are the last places that you would want to end up if you found yourself with some sort of mental health issue. So you could absolutely understand why it would be nicer to, start out in a place that is more friendly environmentally in any case, and then end up somewhere where you're encountering friendly dragons and pink toadstools and encountering something even more magical.
Well, this is it, isn't it, Kari? We still sort of reference 60s and 70s hallucinogenic portrayals of this stuff. I wonder if it's true and your pathway is followed and this is legitimized. What would it be like in the workplace? If you went to your line manager, who I believe is sitting here with us, and said, just so you know, I'm taking a course I'm microdosing LSD at the moment. Do you think you'd feel comfortable doing that? Is the stigma gone for you as an individual?
I think until people start doing that, the stigma's going to remain. Someone's got to get the ball rolling. It's the same, as the use of marijuana to treat conditions. It has to begin somewhere. But, I think if you can go there with good research and good evidence just to back up your arguments, then I would hope that Holden will be understanding when I come to him soon with this suggestion.
As long as you write up the experience for an article in the week.
Yeah, definitely.
It'll be fine.
Done. Deal. Okay, Arion, I'm coming to you next after this.
This podcast is brought to you by Aria Resorts Homes, providing sensational holiday homes and staycation investments. Aria Resorts sells luxurious holiday homes in top UK locations with a 7% annual net return available to qualifying investors at a choice of 3 resorts. Terms and conditions apply. Find out more by searching Aria Resorts Investment.
Okay, Arion, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learnt that to end war we must build locally, piece by piece.
The answer is that international interveners deem the resolution of grassroots conflict an important, unfamiliar, and illegitimate task. The very idea of becoming involved at the local level clashes fundamentally with existing cultural norms, and it threatens key organizational interests. For instance, the very identity of the United Nations as this macro-level diplomatic organization would be upended if it were to refocus on local conflicts.
Severine Otuse's 2015 TED Talk, To Solve Mass Violence, Look to Locals. You can find the whole thing on YouTube. And Arion, this week she's published a book arguing much the same thing.
Exactly right. She's been talking about this for a while, but this week her book, The Front Lines of Peace, came out, which advocates the thing that she was just talking about there, which is a whole new methodology for preventing wars. And the thrust of the book is kind of a criticism of the way that the world currently attempts to keep peace via aid workers and peacekeepers. And she says that the problem with these people is that they live in these homogenous little bubbles, which she calls peaceland, kind of rolling around in their 4x4s and getting drunk with other expats and often really distrusting or not communicating with locals. And she says it's really important, if we are to solve conflict worldwide, to stop trying to end wars in this top-down way, but instead build bottom-up, talk to locals, involve them, involve communities, and that's the way that we're going to end conflict.
And before she was an author and speaker on this subject, she was one of these people she's criticising in Peaceland.
Yes, she was in the Democratic Republic of Congo and experiencing these things firsthand, so she speaks really from experience on this one.
As a kind of like white Westerner with a university education who's parachuted in to try and top-down solve the problem, but then that does come with some successes, doesn't it? I mean, I think I've seen some reviews for this book which are sort of saying this is a manifesto to overthrow the whole system. Is she saying that? There's still a role, isn't there, for the UN and NGOs?
I'm sure there is, but I think that she is advocating overthrowing quite a lot about the system, and she's very critical of the fact that often peacekeepers or aid workers or any sort of UN functionaries, are sent to conflict zones, often not even speaking the language, not understanding anything about the culture, and she sees this as the massive problem that it is just off the top of your head. Just hearing it expressed like that, you're like, well, of course that's a problem. So I think she is advocating really vast change. She doesn't say that there's no role for external bodies, external countries in conflict, but she does say that we need to rethink entirely how we're coming at it.
I suppose the benefit, Kari, of sort of having a management consultancy approach to peacekeeping is that you know who you're sending in. And it's all very well saying, it would be better going to the locals on the ground, but someone's got to decide who those locals are. And the Western organisations who have the money aren't just going to filter a load of cash to people without being there to implement it, surely.
But is there not a means by which these experts can go in and then consult with local people? I read an interview with this author, which she says that international peacekeeping organisations need to ask, not assume, follow, not lead, and support, not rule. And that just sums it up. It's this very one-size-fits-all and quite condescending attitude that we know best, so you just sit back and we will tackle it, don't worry. Whereas you need the local expertise, you need to understand local traditions and the history and all of the individual circumstances that lead to each individual conflict, and without that, of course, you're doomed to failure. It's common sense.
Holden, do you have any case studies to hand from her book where she says this has worked, this approach, or is it just an idea?
Yeah, she does. She makes a couple of case studies. There's one where she gives sort of two different examples in the Democratic Republic of Congo. One of the sort of conventional approach, which is when the UN sent in a police force which was drawn from Congo itself, but from a different area of Congo. This was sort of UN supported, was given some training, but very limited training. And it then didn't really have the backing of either the DR Congo's government or the local people. And because they were outsiders in this particular area, they didn't really have a personal stake in making anything work. And because they didn't have the training and support, they didn't really have the ability to push back the militia and warlords, which was the purpose they were there. And then the Congolese government said it wouldn't pay them, but the UN insisted that it was up to the local government to pay them. So they ended up actually basically preying on the people they were meant to protect and extorting money from local residents. So this was a situation, she says, where this approach made a bad situation much worse.
But is there an example of her better approach working?
Yes. So her alternative is she cites a small charity called the Life and Peace Institute, which in another part of the Democratic Republic of Congo was trying to tackle a series of kidnappings which were presumed by the international aid agency of being the responsibility of Rwandan rebels. But they, instead of going along with this conventional wisdom, they spent several months talking to local farmers, local residents, trying to work out what was actually going on, and unearthed a small dissident group previously unknown and found that they were carrying out these attacks. They then set up a mediation process and managed to successfully effect a kind of reconciliation, which brought this group into touch with the farmers and residents and was able to work out what seems to have been a lasting peace. So it's not complicated, and it's in a lot of ways it's common sense, but it does take time and effort. And she says this whole process cost about £60,000, which is very cheap in terms of international interventions, but it did take several months, and it was one small local conflict. So there's clearly barriers to rolling out this on a much wider basis, which I think is probably the reason that the kind of top-down international aid industry, whether it's government-backed agencies or big multinational charities, haven't been able to enact this in the way that we might have hoped.
But I mean, your point, Olly, as well, about like needing to find the right locals if you're going to execute a best case scenario like the one that Holden just mentioned, is absolutely correct. You do need to find the right people on the ground, but it's not as if these people don't exist. And she says, if we can talk to anthropologists, if we can talk to country specialists and historians in our own countries, then we can get a much better sense of what's going on the ground in the places where we're trying to intervene to resolve conflict.
Maybe, but there's a political advantage, isn't there, to countries getting involved in peacekeeping? And it needs to look a certain way domestically at home. And, send in the historians doesn't really have the same tabloid resonance.
No, but maybe if you sent in the blue-helmeted people with guns and also some historians behind the scenes, then you'd get the best of both worlds.
I mean, I wonder, Kari, it's really interesting, isn't it? In 2021, there are so many parallel conversations going on about how all of our institutions and approaches to the world sort of link back in some hitherto unexamined way to empire or colonialism or the old world order. Is that the case with peacekeeping as well? Like there's something that really needs to be looked at here that has maybe its roots in racism, you might say.
Yeah, I definitely. It's this sort of this we know best approach, and our politics will colour your politics, and that's clearly just not going to work anymore. And you just look at the figures involved in all of this, and it just proves that the current system isn't working. In the past 5 years, wars have cost more than $10 trillion annually. That's 13% of the world's GDP, and have brought the world's worst refugee crisis since the Second World War. There are more than 1.5 billion people living in more than 50 conflict situations worldwide today. So it's not working, is it? Where, and the cost of peacekeeping, huge amounts being spent on it. The approved budget for the UN peacekeeping operations for the current year up to June are almost 7 billion. So, you just look at those figures and these old systems, it's not working for anyone.
But in the old systems, Holden, a lot of the people that were the victims of these regimes were voiceless, and as we talk about a lot on this show, That's not the case anymore. Week by week almost, there's an international situation we now know about because basically people have got mobile phones. So that's changed too, hasn't it?
Yeah, and that might actually be more beneficial to this kind of approach, because it ought to be easier to gather information about what's going on the ground. This whole approach would mean putting more people from Western-backed organisations in danger, I suppose, because you're not. She explicitly says you shouldn't be sending people into places where they're just going to sit in hotels. They're just going to go patrol in 4x4. They need to get into villages, into contact with people. And I think where you do have big charities with HR departments or government agencies with employment policies, there's going to be a real reluctance, and an understandable reluctance, to put people in those sorts of dangerous situations, but also possibly a political reluctance to let people talk to anyone. You could imagine a situation a bit like the one I described in Congo, where they go out to talk to this dissident organisation that had been carrying out the kidnappings, and then it turns out to be labelled a terrorist organisation, and then you have your government agency who sent people out to talk to terrorists. Like, it's that kind of interconnectedness of the world. She uses the phrase a more guerrilla-led approach to peacekeeping, but guerrillas aren't necessarily always the people portrayed in the most positive light.
And she's definitely sympathetic to peacelanders, the people on the ground who have families themselves, that they're not necessarily going to want to go out and meet, the people with Kalashnikovs and try to make friends with them and sit down and have tea, because that's dangerous. So, she does recognise that there are barriers to getting to the sort of, the situation that she imagines could be possible. But I think the benefits, she says, in her view, outweigh the threats.
And you've chosen this, Arion, as your story of the week. I mean, are you prepared to pin your colours to the mast and say, yes, in 10 years' time, people will look back and see this was a really significant book about policy?
I suspect it will feed into a narrative that is something that we think of as significant. I think that we are becoming more clear-eyed about the sort of Western impact on the world, and not just Western, but the sort of the way that powerful countries impact on less powerful countries, often with their very best interests in mind. But it has frequently had this kind of patronising approach that I think we're going to see undone, in part by books like this.
Yeah, that wasn't a hard yes, but I guess that's what I'm going to get. Holden, you're up next after this. Okay, Holden, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Has all play and no work dulled Google's competitive edge?
Employees are there to work, but the company doesn't want them to feel that way. Staff are treated as friends with access to an incredible amount of facilities. We've all heard of an on-site gym, that's nothing new, but the company also offers swim-in-place swimming pools. These are designed to reduce the footprint needed by allowing swimmers to swim against an artificially generated current. Various ping pong, billiards and foosball tables are dotted throughout the campus, with spaces to kick back and enjoy some video gaming too. Google even has its own self-contained pods, which are used by staff members to kick back and relax or to distance themselves from their surroundings in order to get down to work on some heavy tasks.
It's always weird when you hear a British narrator say foosball, isn't it? YouTube channel Tech Vision's insight into Google's headquarters, as was, Holden, because your story is that the Google office layout is changing, and that's been announced this week. But before you tell us about that, remind us what it used to be like. What's it changing from?
Yeah, this, I suppose what they're most famous for is the kind of integration of recreational areas and work. So you did have these, you had sofas and beanbags, as the almost the cliche goes. Now you had table football tables, gyms, swimming pools, canteens that provided free food at any hour of the day and night. And all of this was regarded by some people as innovative, enlightened, supposed to increase productivity, and others tended to just see it as an expensive playground for overgrown kids, or perhaps even more, in a more sinister way, a way of wringing out more labour from company staff by just making them never want to leave the office and go home.
Yeah, because, if you're going to have free breakfast, why would you have breakfast at home and then suddenly you're at work an hour earlier?
Yeah, and there was work shuttle buses, there was all sorts of ways of just trying to, and those shuttle buses would have Wi-Fi, so the implication was that you might want to do a bit of work on your way to and from the office. And so the feeling was that, yes, that Google was not just your employer, but your kind of 24-hour supervisor, nanny, entertainer, creche service.
But no longer, because the world's changed. So what's the story?
The story is that Google's Office of the Future is now an Office of the Past, and they are introducing the new Office of the Future. And this is I think a lot of companies are going through this process where everyone who worked in an office pretty much has been working at home for the last year. And now companies are beginning to think about when they reopen, how they reopen, who needs to be in an office, what's the point of being in an office, and how can they make that a more productive environment. Google has its ideas, and if the past is anything to go by, those sorts of ideas will filter through to other companies too.
Yeah, because they're a huge employer, aren't they? It's not just a PR story. I mean, everyone covers the Google offices because they spend loads of money on it, and it's very eye-catching. But they've got over 100,000 employees, so it really does trickle down into other industries, doesn't it? What have they proposed?
In fact, that number of 100,000 is an interesting one, because some of their executives have said that this is partly driven by COVID, but is actually also just their expansion. And they've even started talking about things like the table football, the sofas, the gyms as being a distraction from work, and suggesting that they've outgrown these. So what they're proposing actually does seem in some ways to be a step back from that integration of work and play, and it seems to be much more about focusing on work and productivity.
These are all very intelligent answers, Kari, but I don't know about you. I was waiting for Holden to tell us about the inflatable wall. Tell us about that.
The inflatable wall, yeah, it basically looks like, I don't know, working inside one of those padded envelopes, sort of being in there. It's on a robot on wheels that contains an inflatable cellophane wall, and it kind of, when you need to have some privacy or, fewer distractions, it wheels over to you and just basically inflates up like a bouncy castle, I suppose.
I was thinking crime scene tent rather than bouncy castle or inflatable envelope. It looks very sinister.
It looks like Death by Mr. Blobby is what it looks like.
It's all a bit creepy. The New York Times described this sort of new focus on modularity and adaptiveness as IKEA meets Lego, and it does all just feel a bit weird and patched together. But yeah, all sorts of, there are team pods that basically contain chairs and desks and whiteboards and storage units on casters, so you can wheel them around and in theory quickly rearrange them. But you read all these things and it's all, fabric based overhead and air duct system that attaches with zips, and they say, you can, for flexible seating formats. It all sounds great in theory, but you're just going to spend half the day wheeling around furniture, surely.
And that's not the best use of employees' time and skills, actually, is it, Arion? There's some very academically intelligent people who work for Google. It's not the best use of their time for them to be wheeling around whiteboards when they should be working.
For sure, and particularly when you compare it with people just being able to log on and work from home. And I gather that quite a lot of Google employees are kind of kicking back in the way that a lot of office employees in general are reacting to the news that we're all going to be returning to offices. And a lot of people are saying, well, not only have we got used to it and found the benefits of being at home and working at home, but also we've realized that it's possible. It's possible to do everything that I needed to do from my home. And so to just try to revive offices in the way that they were before the coronavirus pandemic, that does seem like the sort of a muddle-headed way to come at it. So maybe something about the way that Google is at least rethinking the way that offices might work is sensible. But some of these, surely we're not going to end up with inflatable bouncy castle crime scene robots. That can't be it.
There's also the question of fear, Holden. I mean, here's a telling quote that I spotted in that New York Times article. This is David Radcliffe, Google's Vice President for Real Estate and Workplace Services. Quote, "In the early days of the pandemic, it seemed daunting to move a 100,000 plus person organization to virtual, but now it seems even more daunting to figure out how to bring them back safely." It's a legitimate concern, isn't it, that I'm not as safe at work as I am at home?
Yes, and one of the things that this redesign is intended to address is the idea of giving people more space at work. So they feel they have that the sort of safety barrier or around them, and that's really running counter to the trend that we've seen over the past 20, 30 years, I suppose, of moving away from cubicles and individual offices into open plan areas, fitting more desks, more people into the same amount of space. And that was really driven. Well, I suppose there were two things that could have been driving it. The more obvious is economics and the fact that land is expensive, office space is expensive, but also there was the theory that you would help to drive creativity and collaboration by putting more people in the same space and reducing the sort of physical barriers around them.
Was that really ever sort of justified, or was it just a happy coincidence that it saves costs to do that?
It's a good question, and there has been some research, although not actually that much, about the effects. And it's one of those things that's quite difficult to measure, especially if you're talking about creativity rather than simple productivity. But there was a Harvard Business Review study published a couple of years ago, so before the pandemic, which was trying to look at the effects of moving from cubicles and offices to open plan. And it actually found that two big companies, which had done this supposedly with the aim of increasing interaction between workers, actually found that there was a 70% decline in face-to-face interaction between people in the open plan office. The theory was that if you have people in their own space with a physical barrier around them, they will actively try to cross that barrier and go out and speak to people for a change of scene. If you sit people in rows of desks open plan, they will kind of create a virtual barrier around them and tune everyone out, and actually are much more likely to resort to email, instant messaging to communicate, even with people who are across the desk from them, because that gives them more privacy, and they don't necessarily want their conversation with their workmate to be overheard by 15 other people who are sitting within earshot.
Do you think the open plan office might be coming to an end, Kari?
Yeah, I think it's been on its way out possibly for a while for the reasons, in part I imagine that Holden mentioned. I mean, Google have been investigating, rethinking their approach to office formats from before COVID. They actually launched a study in 2018. They got their research and development team with tasked with addressing 3 trends: that work is increasingly happening outside the office, as in remotely, that what employees need from a workplace is constantly changing, and that workplaces need to be more than just desks and meeting rooms and amenities. So I think COVID has just speeded up the process, but there clearly was some recognition that the open plan format that, Google played a really central role in pioneering, that it just wasn't getting the results they'd hoped for.
One thing that Harvard Business Review piece did suggest was that being in the same space does matter. So people are much more likely to collaborate if they are in the same building, and even on the same floor, they're more likely to consult with other workers. So I think that is something that probably will play a part in the office of the future. And it is possible that the fact that people will work from home more will actually create the space to be a bit more flexible and a bit more inventive with how you divide up your shared office space, have it, more kind of small meeting rooms, more shared spaces, and less desks just in sort of single ranks.
Yeah, well, it's a bit like that thing you were saying about the old-fashioned office. You open the door of your cubicle means come in and have a chat. Actually, the very fact that you're going into an office at all sort of means perhaps you're open for collaboration that day, and that's clearer then, isn't it, boundary-wise?
Yeah, there's much more of a reason to come in. I think a lot of companies are thinking it won't be the default, it will be something people do for a purpose.
I must say, though, that if Google's vision for the future is no longer based around this sort of work meets play, take care of you, give you free food, I will be a bit sad to have missed that, because I always looked at those campuses, the Apple one and the Facebook one, and they have free suites here, and they have,
Did you never get to go, Arion? Have you never had a mate who works at Google who got you in for free buffet?
I got to visit, but I'd never worked there, and I was
Did you
hoping
have free buffet?
It was amazing.
Isn't it? I'm so glad I lived through that era.
Yeah, and I was like, wait, I can take any of this, and all of this food is actually quite good. I just loaded my plate. It was like one of those embarrassing holiday buffets where you go to the thing thinking you're going to have bacon and eggs, and you come back with everything. That was my Google meal experience.
I mean, finally on this, I can't help noticing that in Australia, employees of Google are already back at their desks largely. And in California, obviously, the campus where the majority of Googlers work anyway, is being reconfigured with a lot of outdoor space, because guess what? It's California. That doesn't bode too well for all the employees in Britain and Ireland who are working for these huge American corporations that have got their tax-efficient headquarters here, does it? Because it's freezing cold and wet here 6 months of the year.
It is, although Google does actually say it's planning outdoor spaces in London too. So
yeah, well, good luck with that.
Yeah, I don't know whether that's a sort of underhand way to reduce your workforce. What the plan is,
but we'll see. Hopefully they can invest in some environmentally friendly heating devices. My thanks to Kari, Arion and Holden for their stories this week. Remember, you can subscribe to this show for free. It's like a Google buffet of podcasts. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you find your listening material. And whilst you're there, do remember to search for the retrospectors. Why not? Make me and Arion happy. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.